Chapter 19. What did your dad have to say? Rip asked, after they had both had a few moments to digest their respective messages. He was detained and questioned by the FBI. It seems as though his lawyers were able to get him released for the moment. All of his accounts have been frozen, which includes mine since his name is still on them from when they were first created. He realizes he screwed up, but is glad that I'm safe. He also seems to understand that this is a power play for control of the company. With his accounts frozen and personal credibility currently in the gutter, there will never be a better time to conduct a takeover attempt. Did he mention why they might be doing all of this? I mean, I know your family's company is worth a decent amount of money, but this obviously isn't about money for them. Have there been any interesting new acquisitions or developments on the various R&D projects lately? He pressed. She shook her head. He didn't say. You know he doesn't like to talk about anything related to work over text or the phone. I've been so busy with finals lately that I haven't been able to keep up with the status of any of our latest projects either. I thought he might have broken that rule of his, considering the circumstances. Nope. Ashley bit her lower lip as she concentrated on remembering their active projects. There were a few projects that should have been getting close to their first stage of testing. None of them would have caused this either, not unless they had a major breakthrough of some kind. Even if that happened though, the news should have been kept in-house. Are any of the projects worth enough if that did happen? She bobbled her head from side to side before nodding slowly. Only one of them has the power to change things on a global scale if they had a breakthrough. One of our R&D projects was on a new type of solar panel. If they managed to actually accomplish it. She let the sentence dangle. There was no need to finish and elaborate on what that might mean. Rip was well aware of how much that industry was currently worth, especially to a country such as Saudi Arabia. They had been investing heavily in the solar industry over the last few years. They had a lot of unused open space just going to waste. Assuming that was the project that made the breakthrough, why would they go through all this trouble? They would be able to buy. He stopped talking and slowly shook his head. It was a stupid question. It always came down to money. Why would they buy the finished products when they could simply own the company? They stood to make far more money this way. The world was trying to move away from oil, which meant they needed a way to guarantee their fortunes would grow through another method. What better way was there than with solar power? It made sense in that regard, but only because of how closely oil had become linked to the Saudis' royal family fortune. If it had been any other country, he might have had his doubts. Stealing the information would have been easier. In a way though, this was more honorable and in line with how they did things. They wanted to buy the company and legally take the information. There were lines being crossed in how they accomplished it, but less than most others would have for the same goal. That means someone in the company leaked the results of such a recent breakthrough in the project. She nibbled at a corner of her lip as she thought. The only other government I can think of that might be interested enough in the technology to interfere in some way is China. Every other ruling body, like ours, has other ways of getting the technology, or will simply buy it at a massive discount. As for China, they are more likely to simply try and steal the information from our servers, or reverse engineer the panel once it has been released. As always, the Chinese tended to play fast and loose with laws when it suited them, and complained the loudest when they didn't. In that way, they were the annoying kid on the playground that everyone put up with because they had money and were connected. In other words, whoever had leaked the information had probably done it directly to the Saudis. Well, that is something for your dad to figure out, not us. What we need to worry about is how we are going to get out of here. Unless you feel like sticking around and being picked up by some agents to be questioned. It might be easier if they did that, and if they were lucky, everything would even be over after a few rounds of inane questions. That is, if they were lucky anyway. Would it actually end that simply if we let them pick us up? He hesitated and then shook his head. It's doubtful. They might release us eventually, but there is no telling how long it would take. It is more likely that they would keep us in custody, ostensibly for questioning or our own protection. In reality, it would be done as a favor to the Saudi royal family. Which means, of course, that we would lose all possibility of saving your family's company or helping your dad in a timely manner. How would we even leave Indonesia? You said it yourself, our passports have been flagged. We would never make it through security and onto a plane without getting pulled aside. We need to find the local plumber and then get in touch with a blotter. He told her after a moment, eyeing the stacks of money they had dubiously. Okay, I know what a plumber is. I met one on the island, and somewhat understand what they do. But what is a blotter? Blotters deal in documents, any kind of document that you can imagine. For lack of a better description, blotters are the clerks of the underworld. In the same way that a plumber is the person you go to for weapons or getting in touch with the local cleaner. A blotter is the one you reach out to when you need a new ID, passport, deed, will, diploma, or anything of that nature. An amateur reaches out to a forger on their own. A professional goes through the blotter. He explained, laying out the entire process to her. Wait, so you are telling me there is an entire underground community of people with fancy job titles? Whatever happened to simply being part of the mafia or triad? It's called the Underworld for a reason. There is an entire world that no one ever sees lying just underneath the surface. As for the mafia and triad, he shrugged. They have to obey the rules just like everyone else. At least they do if they want access to the services the Underworld provides, and before you ask. Yes, there are some basic rules, and yes, they do get broken fairly regularly. Justice then gets meted out on the idiot who wanted revenge, or the organization that thought they could get away with it. Ashley looked at Rip for a long moment. What about terrorists? Are they allowed to belong to the Underworld if there are rules? He slowly shook his head. They're banned permanently. Then how did you learn about all of this? I guess you could say I was a sort of gray area in the rules. After I reached, I think it was 10, and I was still alive. People in the organization began to notice me. As long as I wasn't sent on certain, let's say, suicidal missions, they could send me to the local plumber and everyone else. Kids get treated differently, under the rules. I had to learn from a man who had started out with a similar deal, except he was aging out and wanted to take part in those missions. The idiot was a zealot for the group's ideals. He taught me how to get in touch with everyone, made sure I knew everything I needed to know. Rip closed his eyes and swallowed, remembering what had happened next. Then he strapped a bomb to his chest and tried to walk into the main square of the closest town. He gritted his teeth and forced himself to continue. I shot him in the back of the head and put his body in a car and detonated it remotely. 2 people were injured, but no one died. They never found out what I did. As far as they were concerned, the bomb detonated early. It happens. After that, I was always under guard whenever I went to the various underground businesses. There was no chance to escape or send a message. Ashley had her hand covering her mouth as tears silently made their way down her cheeks. It was another glimpse into what his early life had been like, and a part of her wished she had never asked. The local plumber will be able to help us get in touch with a blotter. I doubt we can afford the best quality, but it should be enough to get us out of Indonesia. They can hopefully help us locate a barber as well. With an international airport nearby, there should definitely be a skilled one we can use. Barber. Ashley mouthed. A medic or surgeon. The name is old school. Just think of the Poles you used to find outside their shops. They used to perform both functions back in the day. He explained, shifting uncomfortably while his mind raced. Tomorrow was going to be a busy day. Chapter 20. Ashley helped Rip out of the taxi and grabbed their suitcases. After their experience with the tuk-tuk the day before, they had decided to ensure they called for a proper taxi this time. There was no reason to risk hurting Rip even more just before they were going to get him fixed. He had spent the morning on the phone and perusing through the local phone book until he had found what he needed. Now here they were, standing outside what was clearly a barber shop. There was the familiar striped pole and everything. Rip waited with their 2 suitcases while Ashley wheeled both of the agent's suitcases into different nearby alleyways and left them there. They were unlocked and open. By the time they were finished with their business, both of the cases would be gone. They could have simply thrown them in a dumpster, but this way, at least someone benefited from them. She helped him inside the barber shop, both of them pulling along a suitcase as they headed directly to the back room. The barber looked up from where he was shaving a man's cheek with a straight edge. "Can I help you?" he asked in heavily accented English. They stopped to look at the man as Rip said the appropriate code phrase. "I need a shave off the top from an old family friend." The barber hesitated for only a moment, before nodding towards the back and going back to shaving his client. In the back room was a door with a sliding plate at eye height. When they knocked on it, the plate slid to the side and revealed a pair of eyes that looked them up and down before sliding the plate shut and the door unlocked. The door slid to the side, and a hand motioned for them to come inside. A small Indonesian grandfather was sitting beside an examination bed. The much younger man who had invited them inside closed the door and then hurried to his side. "What do you need?" the old man asked in broken English. Rip pulled off both of his shirts with Ashley's help and tried to explain what had happened to the man. Just when he was about to scream in frustration, his eyes caught on a small masjid with a prayer mat placed in front of it. He had forgotten that many Indonesians were practicing Muslims, which meant that they typically learned Arabic as a second language. While Rip couldn't read the language, he had been forced to learn to speak it. He said a few words to the man, the language he hadn't spoken for years coming easily to his tongue. The old man's eyes brightened as he recognized the words and answered back. At last, they were able to have a decent conversation. It was still a little stilted. The Arabic the man knew wasn't geared towards medical terminology, but it was still better than his broken English. One high-resolution X-ray later, and Rip was sitting on the examination bed, getting his latest bullet hole stitched up. While the assistant was doing that, the old man was examining Rip's chest on his computer monitor. "You were very lucky," the old man told him at last in Arabic, his bushy brows turning away from the glowing monitor. "Your rib bones were put under a lot of stress, but I don't see any." He paused, unsure of what the right word was. "Fractures? Breaks?" Rip repeated both words in English and Arabic for the man, just in case he knew them in that language. "Ah yes, fractures. There are no fractures, only bruising in your muscles and on the bone. Unfortunately, all you can really do for this type of injury is take some painkillers and ice it. Try not to bind the area too much either, otherwise it will affect your breathing, and if possible, avoid strenuous activities." He pointed to Ashley and then Rip with a sly wink and shook his finger. "None of that either for at least a week, 2 would be better." Rip began to laugh, only for it to turn into a coughing fit as he clutched his chest. "That wasn't very nice, Doc," he groaned. Ashley watched the two of them suspiciously, not understanding a word of what they were saying. The assistant went into a back room and returned with a bottle of painkillers for him. They were stronger than what he would get over the counter, but not by much. His injury didn't warrant anything stronger. With Ashley's help, he got dressed again and passed the assistant his card. There was no reason for his bank accounts to have been frozen, even with the payment from Max to him. Paying the plumber and now the barber would wipe out everything he had been given and had saved up on his own. Dealing with people in the underworld was not cheap. He stopped beside the door and turned back to look at the old doctor. "Would you be willing to tell us where the closest blotter is?" The address they were given was the same one Rip had gotten from his calls that morning. With an appreciative nod, they gently closed the door behind them and were on their way back up through the barbershop. Chapter 21. "How many languages do you speak?" Ashley asked Rip once they were safely inside a taxi and on their way to their next destination. "And how has this conversation never come up before? We've been together for years now. I feel like this is something I should have known about you, and yet it's something I'm only now discovering." "That's because I didn't want you to know," he told her softly. "All the languages I know are tied to my time as a child soldier. They would have invited questions that I wasn't ready to answer yet. As for how many I know, fluently, 4, with 3 more being passable to conversational." "Well, which ones?" He sighed and leaned his head back, so he was looking at the ceiling of the car. "English, obviously, then Turkish, Kurdish, and Arabic are the ones I'm fluent in." "Wait," she cut in. "If you're fluent in Arabic, how come you couldn't read the message?" He rolled his head on the worn headdress to look at her. "Have you seen the written language? It's a bunch of squiggly lines that make no sense. Speaking it is easy in comparison. Besides, there was a need for me to learn each of those languages. They are all spoken in Turkey and Syria with some regularity. Reading them, on the other hand, wasn't as much of a concern." She nodded in understanding. "What were the other 3? "Chechen, Armenian, and Greek," he replied, doing his best to keep his mind from going back to those days. Just mentioning the names of the languages he could speak was enough to bring up old memories. Right now wasn't the time to get lost down memory lane. Speaking of the document, it was still buried inside their suitcase. They had forgotten to use the translator app on it the night before. Now the cases were in the trunk of the car, and they still couldn't do it. Ashley could tell the subject was hard for him, and changed it to something else without a second thought. He gratefully squeezed her hand, and together they talked about the local sights as they were driven through the city. A little while later, the taxi stopped outside of a tall business building. Unlike most other underworld businesses, Blotters typically operated out of a large office instead of a back room or small building. As such, they were also one of the exceptions to having the Underworld symbol in the upper right corner of their sign. Depending on the specific services they offered, a blotter could require a lot of room. Some were content with a single office, while others required an entire floor or more for their operation. Each blotter was different and ran their location as they saw fit. Most outsourced everything, or at least the less popular options, and were merely the middlemen for the rest. Others wanted more control, and had taken the various forgers and document makers under their personal wing. Either was fine, though the blotters who were control freaks tended to produce papers that were harder to trace and of a slightly higher quality. At this point, Rip had no idea how much a pair of decent passports would even cost them. Plus, after they bought them, they still had to buy their passage back to the States. The airport was still out. They couldn't risk using the new passports inside a terminal with that sort of security. If they had a private plane, then it might have been a different matter, but they didn't. That really only left the water. Unless another method somehow made an unexpected appearance. Which frankly they both hoped was the case. While Rip needed some time to heal, he didn't want the downtime the weeks at sea would include. That time would be better spent doing other things, like making sure Ashley's family's company wasn't taken over. It would be hard to do that if they weren't there. Convincing the board she was a viable candidate remotely was also a no-go. They needed to be in the States and at that meeting when it happened. Either backing up her father, Max, or stepping in to take over herself. After what they had done, there was no way she was going to let the Saudis take over her family's business. Ashley would burn it to the ground first, before that ever happened. That didn't mean there weren't ways the Saudis could succeed, there were. It would simply be very expensive for them to do so. Her family owned the controlling interest in the company. However, that was only 25% of the shares. More than anyone else by far. If the Saudis were serious and really wanted to spend some money, then they could realistically get controlling interest themselves and perform a hostile takeover. It was why having Max's accounts frozen was such a serious threat at the moment. He couldn't buy more stocks from his own company and increase his controlling interest. It was likely all part of their plan, and Rip had to hand it to them. So far, everything was going beautifully for them. Hopefully, soon they would be able to start disrupting things. Chapter 22. Rip stared at the carefully handwritten prices on the paper the blotter had passed to them, across the top of his expensive mahogany desk. He wanted to throttle the fool, and then shoot him in both his legs. He could understand prices having gone up in the years since he had left the business, but this was ridiculous. He had to hold back though. Shooting an official staff of the Underworld came with serious repercussions. Unless, of course, he could prove the idiot was skimming from the proverbial till for some stupid reason. That was the only reason he could think of for the ridiculous prices he was seeing at the moment. This blotter must have thought they were newbies and taken them for absolute suckers. Instead, he took a photo of the prices and made sure his phone was recording the conversation. Good advice was good advice. "Are you sure these are the real prices that you want to be quoting me?" Rip asked, slipping his phone back into his pocket as he tapped the sheet of paper. A flicker of uncertainty flashed across the man's face. It was the first sign he had shown of having some proper intelligence. It was quickly squashed the next second with the words that proceeded to come out of his mouth. "Of course, these are the real prices. They are determined by the tier quality, costs involved for labor and materials, along with service fees. I know. It was all explained to me the first time I went through the process years ago," Rip told the man, who had begun to lose some color in his face. "What I don't understand is how the prices for everything have risen by 9 times since the last time I had some papers made." He finished with a growl as he balled up the paper and threw it back at the man's face. Ashley watched all of this going on from her seat beside him with an amused expression. She had sat in on enough of her father's business meetings to know how this sort of discussion was going to play out. Rip stood and with slow, deliberate steps walked around the desk to the blotter. His fingers idly stroked the various objects that littered the top of his nice, sturdy desk. "Tell me, is it still against the rules of the Underworld to skim off the top of the books?" When he said that, Ashley's face flickered thoughtfully before returning to normal. The blotter reached for the phone, only for his hand to be crushed mercilessly under the round marble paperweight in Rip's fist. "I asked you a question," Rip snarled, pushing the screaming man away from his desk. The blotter cradled his ruined hand, snot and tears trailing down his face as he nodded. "Then why would you ever think it was a good idea to do exactly that? Last time I checked, you people all made good money doing these jobs." "We all have our vices," the man blubbered out weakly. "Some are just more expensive than others." You cannot be getting enough new, unsuspecting people to make the risk worth your while, Ashley pointed out. I would think that in a business like this, most of your customers already know what to expect. This area has a slightly higher than normal average of new customers, the blotter ground out, as he reached for a bottle of prescription pills hidden on a shelf underneath his desk. I generally get 1 or 2 a week. Both Rip and Ashley were surprised at the number, which was much higher than they were expecting. They had been thinking more along the lines of 1, maybe 2 new people a month, not a week. Rip bent over with a soft grunt and picked up the wadded piece of paper and put it back on the desk. All right, fine. We want the most expensive package. New identities, accounts, passports, the works, and at a quality that would let us walk through an embassy security line without a second glance. You'll be paying for it, of course. In return, my recording of this little conversation never gets spread around, and you never come after us for this encounter. Are we clear? Whatever he had taken seemed to be kicking in fast as he was slowly relaxing his grip on his broken hand. Deal, he slurred. Leave me your number, and I'll tell you where to meet them to pick everything up. Your pictures can be taken on the way out. Rip shook his head in disgust. Be more careful of who you try and scam in the future. Together, he and Ashley left the room and proceeded to have their photos taken for their new identities. They would be presented with a list of possible names in a few hours. I have a feeling that he isn't going to live much longer, even if he doesn't come after us, Ashley said, as they were heading to a different hotel for the evening. Oddly enough, I have the exact same feeling. He started to get sloppy in his dealings. It's only a matter of time before he makes the same mistake. She nodded and leaned closer to him, so the driver wouldn't accidentally overhear. I've been wondering about this for a while now. What is this business with the rules of the Underworld? You mentioned skimming off the tops of the books earlier. Is there someone above all of these people? You know, someone who rules, sets these guidelines, and collects the money or something? Rip scratched the back of his head before shrugging. I have no idea. I've never really thought about it, if I'm being honest. It was just how everything was explained to me when I was introduced to it as a kid. I wasn't allowed to ask a lot of questions back then. Everything I know, I more or less picked up on the fly. I guess it would make sense that there is some kind of ruling body. You realize that would make them infinitely more powerful and wealthier than any existing government, right? She chuckled darkly. I guess all those conspiracies about shadow states and dark nations might have been onto something after all. He rolled his eyes. It's above my pay grade either way. For all we know, everything might be controlled by covert branches of the existing governments anyway. Actually, now that he thought about it, there was a certain amount of sense behind that particular train of thought. If the underworld was controlled by covert branches of the government, then they would be able to keep track of the professional side of things while also earning money from them. Not to mention, everyone knew that the government loved to employ shadowy types for their more unsavory jobs. He wasn't 100% convinced they had inadvertently stumbled their way onto how it worked. At the same time, he would be willing to give it higher than average odds of them being involved in some way at the top. Regardless, he really didn't want to know too much about how everything operated. This was one of the occasions where knowing too much could get you killed. Ashley opened her mouth to say something, only to slowly close it when he shook his head. Right, she said after a few moments. Some things are better off not knowing, especially when it concerns an underworld full of assassins and people who clean up messes for a living. Inside their new hotel room, Rip pulled out the documents they had gotten from the now-dead operatives. He had to go over it line by line twice to make sure they got everything. Not to mention the translation was a little wonky in places, but it was good enough. It was understandable in any case. The first letter was a general outline of the mission. The second listed information on the people from the photographs that had been in the second envelope, namely him and Ashley. The third and fourth sheets of paper were all about possible groups they could have used instead of the mercenary group. Do spies usually leave information like this in their suitcases? Ashley asked once they had finished copying it all down onto fresh sheets of paper that they could read. Not if they were competent, Rip replied with a snort, tossing his phone onto the bed and reaching for a bottle of water and a pill to dull the pain in his chest. And that's the crux of the problem here. Nothing about this situation has been normal. I can't tell if those two were trainees, idiots, red herrings, or any other number of things. If we hadn't seen that squad waiting at the terminal when we arrived, I wouldn't even be certain at this point that I could say that it was the GIP who orchestrated this entire affair. Ashley stood up and walked around the room as she thought. Does it matter? She asked at last. I mean, we aren't spies. We don't have to play whatever game it is they are playing here. We don't know the rules or the pieces. Hell, we don't even know what kind of board we might be on. So why are we even trying to figure all of this out? No offense, Rip, but you aren't built to be a spy. You couldn't charm the panties off a mannequin. You do seem to be pretty good at killing things, though. He rolled his eyes. Offense taken. I seem to remember charming you well enough that we've been together all this time. I see your point, though, and Nathan actually told me the same thing in his last message. Let's play to our strengths then. I'll kill everything that stands in our way of getting home, and you can focus on not losing your family's company. And quit calling them that. It makes my neck itch. Something Nathan taught me is that you say. He rolled his neck, having to force the words out. Spy, or espionage, or any of the three-lettered agency names. It's just not done. You say agent, operative, agency, the company, whatever. Directly calling them out like that is a good way to get someone killed, as you never know who could be listening. Ashley nodded, taking his point to heart. All right, I understand. She pointed to the papers. I agree with the previous point as well. For now, those don't matter, we can let someone else play their game. Whichever way we are getting home, though, needs to have good cell and internet service. I'll need to be connected the entire time, and sweetie, we can talk about who charmed who later. Chapter 23. Rip stared at the options they had been sent for possible names, and immediately crossed out half the list. He wasn't going to be known as a John, Chandler, or Stephen if he could help it. This was a premium package name, which meant it was something that you could build a new life around. That meant it came with everything someone needed to do that: social security number, or the chosen location equivalent, bank account, the works. The most expensive package came with everything you needed to not just build that new life, but actually live it. That meant this name needed to be something he was comfortable using in the long term. Because if things went sideways, that is exactly what he would be doing, and it was the same for Ashley. He had a feeling most of the options on Ashley's list would meet a similar fate within a few seconds of her seeing them. She had told him more than a few stories of girls she hadn't liked growing up with, most of which appeared as common names on that list. Working together, they selected their new first and last names and sent them back. While they were waiting for their new documents to be finished, Ashley was looking up alternative ways for them to get home. Rip had finally responded to each of the unknown numbers that had messaged him before with a simple text. It told them that staying in the area was not possible, and that if they wanted to talk, they apparently had his number. That was it. He wasn't going to turn it off or take out the battery like you saw people do in the movies. This was his personal phone, and it had been modified to get rid of anyone's ability to track him. It wasn't even that hard. Anyone with a rooted Android phone and a little knowledge could do the same thing. Granted, you still had to worry about being triangulated through the signal towers connected to your phone. However, that only gave them a general area, nothing more, and in a crowded city it was next to useless. Ashley's phone was still a concern, though. He would need to talk to her about it later. While they waited for word on their documents, Rip cleaned his gun and took another look at the items in the belts. He carefully put some money in each, keeping it thin enough to not bulk out the leather and make it uncomfortable. The insides of the zippered belt already contained everything else somebody might need if they were in an emergency in an urban environment. After taking stock of their supplies, he had to admit they were better off than he had thought. The fact that they hadn't needed to pay for their new identities had definitely helped with that as well. Well, we have a few options, and none of them are very good, Ashley told him as she tossed her laptop onto the bed and rubbed her eyes. The best options are obviously way outside our price range at the moment. All the water-based options that I could find aren't leaving soon enough, or will take several weeks to get there. So that leaves us with what? Leapfrogging the journey back, or sneaking onto a plane? She snorted. Unless you know how to fly. She looked at him carefully. You don't, do you? He shook his head. No, that is definitely not a skill I ever picked up. Sneaking onto an international flight wouldn't be easy. We would be better off sneaking onto either a parcel flight or a military flight. Both have their downsides. 1. We have to sneak onto a military base and find out when their next scheduled flight is, which might not even be right away. Parcel flights, like FedEx and UPS, however, have a different issue. From what I understand, the hold where they store the mail and packages aren't heated. It will be pressurized, but it could reach freezing temperatures with low oxygen as an almost certainty. That is, unless we luck on a flight transporting live animals, but then there would be increased supervision, monitoring everything. Which do you think would be easier to do? Ashley asked, while biting her lower lip. Obviously the parcel flight, but we would need to get some warm clothes and oxygen tanks. Then sneak everything onto the flight with us, all without being caught, and don't forget, I'm injured right now. Rip pointed to his chest. That said, it probably is our best chance at getting back to the States on time. Not to mention, we wouldn't have to go through any pesky security checks if we do it right. He leaned back and closed his eyes while he thought. All right, let's do it. We'll head to wherever the closest international mail site is, if it isn't here. Then we'll spend a day or two scoping everything out, while getting the items we'll need.